Lecture 17, Ethics, Secrets and Scandal. So in this lecture, learning outcomes are for you to understand the difference between morals and ethics. Okay, there is a fundamental difference between morals and ethics, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But it will be interesting for you to think about that question now. What's the difference between morals and ethics? And I'll ask you again in a minute, see if anybody can come up with a satisfactory response to that. Also, within this, because of the ethical framing of what we're talking about here, is that I'm going to ask a question, and I would like you to appreciate some of the arguments surrounding that question about what's the value of the profit-making firm. There's a perception that the more profit a firm makes, or the bigger the firm is, the better it is. But why? What is it that it does? What is the value of the profit-making firm to a wider society? Now, we understand quite readily what the value of a profit-making firm is to its shareholders, but how does that translate into everybody else? Particularly when you consider the innovations in the technological innovations really need to show some kind of systemic social value. It's the point of improving individual lives, the quality of our lives, the duration of our lives, maybe. So we'll ask some questions about that. And that is a very challenging and quite philosophic area. So I'm not wanting you to be au fait with the intricacies of the debates and so on and so forth, but I would like you to think about it in a way that's being critical to challenge that notion that the large profit-making firm has more value than, say, a non-profit or a smaller making firm, or indeed a loss-making firm. So let's be honest, Tesla, Amazon were loss-making for a long, long period of time. Well, Tesla probably still is, to be perfectly honest. We shall see next year in their accounts next year. And then also, I started off by bringing to your attention how, what I said actually, I think it was either lecture 1 or lecture 2, is that the big tech, finance and government are kind of interlinked and related. And they've created a fairly unique contemporary conjuncture. And so by way of concluding this, we'll bring the whole debate back to the linkages between technology, finance, and government. And one of the things that does link them together is that they are in agreement or complicit in the way that they act, but also is that they are all subject to different levels of secrecy. Secrecy to the extent that we, on the outside, are not aware of all of the prevailing elements and factors that exist within big tech, within finance, and within government itself. And I'll outline some of those. And I can only outline some of those because it's a big issue. And if you're interested in this, just dive into some of the current news stories. And I'll identify some of the biggest controversies that have occurred, because to my mind, is that businesses, whether it be finance or technology and government, will always court controversy. There will always be areas in which we can criticize them for it. And it's not, if you like, making the error. The error is in trying to cover it up. And if you just look at, say, if you go back years into Tony Blair, right, who was the leader of the Labour Party in the UK, and his party were very much in support of the war in Iraq because of weapons of mass destruction. They believed that the Iraqis were creating weapons of mass destruction, and that was the legitimized reason why the British, along with their allies, should invade Iraq and try and depose Saddam Hussein. But the narrative changed from one about getting rid of a tyrant and so on and so on and so forth, because the legitimate reasons as to why they should invade Iraq were to all intents and purposes discredited. And it wasn't Blair's making the mistake. It was the trying to cover it up that really brought down Tony Blair. Yeah. And a more recent example would be this Christmas party shenanigans and Boris Johnson and the complete mental, I don't know, how would you call it? Mental maze that he's got himself wrapped up in by suggesting that these parties either didn't exist, and if they did exist, they were well within COVID regulations, which of course is bollocks because they were all illegal at that particular point in time anyway. So if they existed, therefore the fact that they existed are they were illegal, or they were outside of the guidances anyway. Whether they're illegal is a different thing. It's a law question, which I'm not qualified to answer, to respond to, but they're certainly outside of the guidances. But if you can imagine that if somebody had said, well, were there these parties? And he went, yeah, they were. We shouldn't have had them, should they? That was terrible. It was a complete mistake. And I just want to fundamentally and sincerely apologize to the nation. It probably would have got away with it. But to consider to hide it, it's the secrecy that's the damaging aspect of it. Not the error itself. We all make errors, but it's the covering it up that really is quite detrimental. And so I'm going to illustrate some of those as we go through it, because I just think that there's part of me that says that at the end of it, we come to the end of this lecture series, we can have a bit of fun as well. And I think that these are interesting. And they are, to my mind, they're extreme examples and they're a bit mind-boggling as well. And you just go, goodness gracious, how did we manage to come down this route or down this road? And I will explain a few of them to you. So we've dealt with some challenging issues within this program. We've dealt with the derivatives and the global financial crisis and the fact that people that effectively couldn't afford a mortgage were given mortgages. We've dealt with income and wealth inequalities. We've dealt with work and the precarious nature of work and technological unemployment in the light of growing technological advance. We've talked about things like inequality of opportunity, the digital divide. We've talked about the immateriality of the tax liabilities and so on and so forth. And they're just some of the things that we've talked about that are controversial or provocative in some respect, but they, at their core, they all identify a moral dilemma or an ethical dilemma. And to an extent, the program is orientated around ethics, about, is that what we should be doing as a society, as an economy, as a polity, as a people? Is this a good thing? Because that's what morals and ethics come down to, doesn't it? Is it a sense of, is this good or bad? And again, I have no monopoly on truth here. And the argument as to whether this is good or is bad is not a cut and dried, black and white question. Within the black and white, there are multi-hued levels of grey. There will be some good aspects and there will be some negative aspects, but it's on balance of the evidence, we need to make a conclusion. And really, that's what we're asking you to do. And that's what we're asking you to do through the course of your studies, is to critically appraise and on the balance of the evidence, not your belief or your opinion, because social science is not a religion. It's not based on faith, which your opinion is based upon faith. I believe in X, Y, and Z. Well, that's fine. But what gives you the grounds to believe that? And that has to be the evidence. As if there is no evidence, we are effectively just joining the masses of people that are coming from perspectives that are drawn from all sorts of different opinions in order to create a tapestry of falsehoods. Okay? And you, as social scientists, budding social scientists, your job is to be critical, to analyze the evidence, to create an argument, and on the balance of the evidence, make a conclusion. And in effect, that's what I'm asking you to do in your papers. But the issues that we've raised so far have a strong moral and ethical frame. So you'll have seen that already, but I'll ask that, at the beginning, I asked you, what's the difference between morals and ethics? Does anybody want to have a go? Would anybody like to answer that question? Go on, Liam, you've usually got something to say for yourself. What do you say about this one?
Well, I think morals are sort of set by what people sort of believe is right, whereas ethics could be more based on like evidence and on real life examples.
Not a bad attempt, sir. Not a bad attempt. You're not right, but you're not wrong either. But it was not a bad attempt. Anybody else wants to have a go? Artem, come on. Join the fun.
I mean, ethics and morals, I think they're in some ways quite similar. I mean, before this lecture, maybe we have used them interchangeably.
Yes, I agree that people do use them interchangeably. They probably didn't talk to, however, but they're not talking. I often think about this as being, as I do quite a lot of teaching on leadership, and people say to me, what's leadership? And actually, leadership very often is presented as being good general management. And if you take any statement that's got leadership in it, and you put the word management in it, but it doesn't change the meaning of the actual statement, then effectively you're talking about the same thing. Now, you could do the same with morals, because you could interchange morals with ethics. And if it doesn't change the meaning of the statement, then in effect, you've conflated the terms. You've conflated them to mean the same things. But there are two words, morals and ethics. So if we meant the same thing, we'd only have one word. Well, there's more than one word. So there must be something different about them. And that's the thing. What is it? That's what it is. Will we get access to an MCQ test via Blackboard? There's one on there already. It's been there since week 5. Ethics equals values.
The actual final version.
Pardon?
Sorry, the final version, the actual assessment on the day of the exam.
Oh, yeah, you get it via Blackboard. Yeah. There's a link on Blackboard. It comes that way. Yeah. Ethics equals values. Okay. Morals, what an individual chooses to have, but it depends upon cultures. Okay. Well, ethics might be contingent upon cultures as well. And I think that what we're doing here is what we're portraying, or what I'm introducing you to, is that there is a tension that exists between the morals and the ethics. And let me give you an example. You'll all have heard of Adolf Hitler. Okay. Yeah. Now, I have no doubt that Adolf Hitler believed that he was morally correct in what he was doing. He had a moral justification for his actions. But ethically, we would look at his actions and say that they were repugnant, horrific. Yeah. And that gives you an idea about the nations of morals and ethics, in that morals are something that you hold about good and bad, whereas ethics is something that we hold about good and bad. So that does mean that you can be in tension. You could be morally right, but ethically wrong. And morals and ethics compete against each other. And let me give you an example, or a couple of examples. Is that years ago, I used to sell beer, right? And alcohol. Now, that in certain circumstances could be deemed to be ethically a wrong thing to do or reprehensible. But morally, I can justify it because I say that I am supporting myself. I'm supporting my wife, my family, my kids. You know, I'm a productive member of society. Now, some of the practices that we used to use in order to get people to drink more beer were both morally and ethically wrong. We wouldn't be able to get away with doing things like we used to do now, and that's a good thing. Trust me, that shows that we can progress when we try. But there's a tension that exists between the moral and the ethical. You could argue that the bankers in the global financial crisis were operating within their own system of ethics. Sell more, make more money. But outside of that system, it might be deemed that actually what they were doing was something that was unethical. Yeah? So there's rarely a right and a wrong for all of these sorts of things. It is, again, it comes down to this concept of arguing on the basis of evidence and drawing a conclusion. But people cannot be morally correct. Well, let me try, I'll qualify that. people may well claim that they are morally and ethically, that their behavior is morally and ethically influenced. And I think that that is probably misguided, is that there will always be times when we step out of line with what is deemed to be the norm. Okay, so we refer to ethics as a branch of moral philosophy that examines concepts of right and wrong to defend, recommend appropriate behavior. Ethics involves the collective or a societal perspective. Inherent within this is individual subjective complexity, is that we all have agency, we all have opinions, we all make meaning, we can interpret things as we wish. Yeah. When applied to business, ethics refers to the principles and standards that guide that business. And it's worth me pointing out at this stage is that the relationship between regulations and ethics, people will say, oh, what we need is stronger regulations. Well, on what basis do you create the regulations? The regulations are usually created as the lowest common denominator in order to be able to regulate against behavior that we've already seen. Yeah. Not about future behaviors. That's where ethics kicks in. Ethics guides behaviors without the regulations. Ethics sits on top of the regulatory framework, which can only ever be seen as being the lowest minimum of what is acceptable or legal. And so when we go back and think about our frameworks, our world, and our interest in markets and economy and so on and so forth, is that there is and exists a moral justification for the market. The market as perceived as being something which is a self-stabilizing general equilibrium model. And it was put forward by this guy here, Wilfredo Pareto. And Pareto is probably most commonly known as being of the kind of like the 80-20 relationship, the Pareto ratio. But Pareto was a bit of a polymath, really, and he was a very creative individual, and he wrote some marvelous tomes, but all of them, of course, at the turn of the last 20th century, and to our mind are interminably written and not very interesting. But Pareto also posited the notion of the Pareto efficiency in the Manual of Political Economy, which I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that you should go and look up. But an allocation of goods is Pareto optimally efficient when there is no possibility of a redistribution in a way where at least one individual will be better off while no other individual ends up worse off. In other words, no one can gain to the detriment of somebody else within an optimally efficient economy. As a consequence of that, there is a moral justification for the economy as a market-based equilibrium system, because the optimum efficiency, Pareto optimum efficiency, not surprisingly, corresponds to general equilibrium. So as we move towards general equilibrium, people may benefit, but not to the detriment of everybody else. It's based upon merit, hard work, endeavor, and entrepreneurship and innovation, I guess. But nevertheless, Pareto optimal efficiency provides us with a moral grounding for market-based theory. We can explore that by looking at the evidence. So scandals. There have been many corporate scandals, financial, and you wouldn't have to go too far to think about them. There's Volkswagen, there's British Home Stores, Tesco's, Enron and WorldCom as being some of the real big core celebs, but there are lots of them. And all of these firms are operating, at least in theory, or as a justification, as a moral justification, in order to maximize their profits, in order to conform with this concept of general equilibrium. And yet scandals occur. Moral issues occur. Now, within the frameworks of general equilibrium models, which are quite rarefied and depend upon axioms in order to be true, and you could argue that it's a heuristic system, it's something which is designed to help inform rather than ultimately depict literally, although very often it is presented as being a literal depiction of economy. But it's hard to ignore the fact that these exist. And I'm arguing here that when you bring in secrecy or opacity, is that the scandals are worse. And these are some of the biggest ones that have been opaque over the years. So the sugar industry is that I think it was the 1940s, actually. Somebody will Google this and prove me wrong, I'm sure. But nevertheless, there were two corresponding studies that tried to look at prevalences of obesity and what were causes of obesity or weight gain. There was a study in the US that said that the problem was fat, and it was the fat content of food that made people put on weight. And there was a study in the UK that said that it was sugar. And it was sugar that that meant people put on weight and led to obesity. Well, the sugar industry effectively got together in order to disparage the fat-based findings. And hence, that's why you get low-fat food, because the sugar argument, the sugar industry won the argument. It was fat ratio. We need low-fat foods. You get low-fat foods, which are no good for anybody because they're loaded with salt and sugar. You have to. There's no flavour. If you take all the fat out, you take a lot of the flavour out. So you put the flavour back into it by compounding salt and sugar into it. So any of you that are out there that are eating low-fat food in the grounds that you think that it's healthier for you, it's not, I'm afraid to say. Because the arguments were taken on by the sugar industry in order to, they saw that there was a threat. Yeah, Liam, what did you want to ask?
Apparently, the Global Energy Balance Network was only created in like 2014.
The what, sorry?
The Global Energy Balance Network that we were on about with Coca-Cola.
Yeah.
Apparently, that was only created in 2014.
This is the modern take on it, is that the controversies relating fat and sugar have been going on for a long, long time. It's the 1960s. The study was in the 1960s. I should read my own slide. But that's recent, is that the Global Energy Balance Network is funded by Coca-Cola. And what they're suggesting is that the Global Energy Balance Network is designed to promote exercise as being the solution to obesity. Now, I'll tell you now, you can't outrun a bad diet. If what you do is that you eat Big Macs and drink lots and lots of Coca-Cola, it's not possible to be able to do that level of exercise every day. It's nonsense. And it becomes more apparent to you as you get older as well. I can assure you of that one as well. But Coca-Cola funded or are funding, along with lots of other parts of the sugar industry, are funding the obfuscation of the fat-based myths in food. Okay, that's the point that I'm making. And when you look at levels of obesity globally, they're really high and growing substantially. When I first went to Singapore 25 years ago, everybody was very slim. And people ate traditional foods, Malaysian, Thai, Singaporean type foods. And there were no fast food restaurants at all. There's Moss Burger, but nobody ever went to Moss Burger because it's shite. Now, when you go back to Singapore, it's McDonald's, everything's all over the place. Fast food is everywhere. The size of the people have changed. They're a lot rounder than they used to be. Now, that's not because of the fast food, because that would be pandering to the fast food myth about fat in food, but it's more about sugar, in that there is a strong consumption of sugar in that country, which has gone up significantly since people started to drink coffee. Because coffee, if you have 10 cups of coffee during the course of the day, that's a bit much, isn't it? But 5 cups of coffee a day and you put 2 teaspoons of sugar in it, that's an enormous amount of sugar. And then you add in a large Coke, as an example, which has got, I can't remember how many teaspoons of sugar in it, but then you supersize that and you get a max one, 20 ounces of Coke. There's an awful lot of sugar that you've added into your diet. And the sugar industry are doing their level best to convince people that's not the case. What people need to do is more exercise and reduce their fat content. It's a nonsense. Another one, in 1979, Exxon, oil and gas company, released a report that suggested that, or stated that, burning fossil fuels will cause dramatic environmental effects in the coming decades. So by the late 1970s, we're well aware of the impact of burning carbon-based fuels and ejecting the resulting exhaust fumes into the air. In other words, is that Exxon were one of the first people that came up with the theoretical foundations for climate change. But the oil industry have spent the intervening periods convincing people, governments, et cetera, that actually oil and gas is the only way in which we can fuel our economies. And other alternatives are too expensive, or they won't work, or they're unreliable, and so on and so forth. And of course, that's not the case. The technology is readily available. And it's not necessarily people like Exxon themselves, but if you look at think tanks and lobbying groups and see where the money comes from. So Koch Industries, which is an oil and gas firm, spend literally millions of dollars a year lobbying government and writing reports that suggest that climate change is not a thing. The oil and gas industry are as responsible for the anti-climate change, or the climate change is a hoax concepts and ideas, as any other institutional framework on the planet. And you have to ask the reasons that, well, we know why they would do that, but it raises all sorts of moral questions, doesn't it, about the justifications for doing that? Particularly, I mean, I would probably have a little bit more respect for oil and gas that said, yeah, hands up, it is problematic. We really ought to do something about this. But that's not happening, is it? And then the opioid crisis is another one. And I appreciate that these aren't connected to our subjects of finance and big tech and so on and so forth, but I'll come on to those in a bit. But what it does is it indicates that some of the best, or the best, that's number one in the scandals of the 20s. I don't mean best in that respect. I mean, some of the biggest scandals are those that have been wrapped up in levels of secrecy. The opioid crisis is a company by the name of Purdue Pharmaceuticals. I don't know if any of you watch Amazon Prime, but on Amazon Prime, there's a series called Goliath, and they've just done the final run of Goliath, which is a courtroom drama. But in this series, the last series, which I think is series 5, it is a replay of the opioid crisis in America. It's based upon the story. It's very good, actually. It's well worth watching if you've got a mind to do it. Goliath on Amazon Prime, which of course you're all well aware is, and I really wouldn't support Amazon as a business because of the fact that I find them morally repugnant, because of the fact that they don't pay their taxes and their fair taxes and so on and so forth. But Goliath is a great thing to watch. And you as students, you get Amazon Prime for what, 37 quid a year, I think it is, which is good business, isn't it? Notwithstanding its moral. And I think that raises a question, is that to what extent am I prepared to buy something even though I find it morally reprehensible? But Purdue Pharmaceuticals released a drug, the name of OxyContin, and they knew it was addictive. I mean, it's an opiate. There's very, very little difference in terms of the chemistry of heroin and opiate painkillers. Yeah, and OxyContin is highly addictive. The point being is that Purdue knew it was. Now, there is a whole framework of distribution of drugs through pharmaceutical firms and doctors and GPs and so on and so forth that supports the whole concept of free availability of drugs, is that it's more of a consumer choice. I want to take X, Y, and Z rather than being a medical choice, which strikes me as being slightly odd from somebody that comes from a UK perspective, where your doctor would suggest that you should take something. But within the US, is that the consumer would say, no, I want to take this. And there's a much stronger culture of taking pills. Now you have to ask yourself why that's the case. But what's interesting, what was interesting to me about the opioid crisis is not necessarily the secrecy that went into quelling the myths or the alleged myths about the addiction of OxyContin, was more about how industry players like Purdue and others utilized and brought the big consulting houses and the banks in order to support their activities. Is that McKinsey, the consulting house of McKinsey, worked hand in glove with the pharmaceutical industry in order to support and to grow the distribution and the consumption of opioids. Now, they've always maintained that they didn't know that they were addictive and so on and so forth, which I take with a small pinch of salt. But nevertheless, is that we're fined $573 million for their role in assisting Purdue alone. In fact, they suggested to Purdue is that they should send out higher strength, they should market higher strength tablets, which of course are more addictive. And this was also, is that McKinsey continued to work for Purdue after the firm had pleaded guilty to charges of misleading doctors, which I think was in 2005. So the firm itself had said, yeah, you're right, this is what we've been doing, we plead guilty to this. And they settled, of course, out of court. But McKinsey continued to work for them. And I think that this leads to a whole new problem, which is also morally contingent, is that after the scandal, you get a classification of different addicts, in that opioid addicted people are patients, heroin addicted people are addicts. Patients deserve care, addicts deserve imprisonment. One is criminalized, the other is not. The other is supported by the industry that put them in the place, the same place, put them in that place in the first instance. And it is not surprising that, for the most part, opioid patients are white, criminalized addicts are black. So there is a moral element to this as well. Pasquale's work in 2015, and it's called the Black Box Society, I think, but I'll link it on online reading. Reading's online. And he argues that secrets and obfuscation leads to this concept of opacity, a deliberate strategic attempt in order to make things opaque so people can't readily see through in order to find out what's going on. But ultimately, what he's doing is he's drawing attention to the veil that's over the mechanisms of industry, whether it be finance, whether it be technology, or whatever it is. Now, Pasquale focuses specifically upon finance and big tech. Big tech more than finance itself. We'll come on to some of those things in a minute. But let's start from, I mean, what he does do is he draws attention to those tripartite dynamics, engines of our society, engines of our economy: government, big tech, finance. So let's deal with finance first. There are widespread scandals in banking and finance, not least global financial crisis and the credit derivatives. But also over the recent times, and just in the UK, is that it's been benchmark rate of LIBOR, the London overnight banking rate, has been manipulated. It was manipulated by bankers in order to benefit themselves to the detriment of their own clients. And that was a case that was proven. And there was only one prosecution, even though it was widespread fraud. is that LIBOR as a rate actually is a gentleman's agreement between senior bankers rather than something that's established. And they've done away with LIBOR now. There's more of a established rate that's utilised now. But LIBOR used to be the benchmark for other commercial loans. So you would get a loan that was 1% above LIBOR, and it would fluctuate over a period of time, which allowed for the selling of credit swaps or interest rate swaps, in that people thought that the interest rate was going to go up, and so they would hedge against that by taking out an interest rate swap. But when it went down, is that they got penalised very, very heavily. Well, the market rates were being manipulated by bankers. And again, that was another case that went to the High Court. And that's an example of mis-selling of financial products. But probably the most famous one of mis-selling financial products is PPI, personal payment insurances. Is that firms that were selling things like televisions and white goods, fridges, freezers, except washing machines and so on and so forth, would ask people, would you like to take out payment insurances on your purchase if you were buying it on credit? The idea being is that if you suffered a loss of work or whatever, is that your goods were not at limit, were not at risk, because the payment protection insurances would kick in and would continue to make the payments if you were ill or if you lost your job or whatever. And it was up to you as to whether or not you wanted to take it on, or whether or not you could say, no, I'm fine, I've got a good job, I don't need the PPI. Or you might say, yeah, things are looking a bit risky, I'll take the PPI out. Well, is that retailers soon found out that it was more profitable to sell the PPI than it was to actually sell the washing machine in the first place. Is that you made more money because of the fees that were originated in the contractual agreement, and then the interest rate payments over the 3 to 5 years that they were taken out. So in the end, they stopped asking people whether they wanted PPI, and they just bundled it up in the original contract, and you got it whether you wanted it or not. So when you originated the finance, there would be a fee at the bottom that said fees. You know, what's that for? It was not mentioned in the credit agreement. Opacity, obfuscation, secrecy. And that was billions. That was billions of pounds. That was just in the UK. And that was billions of pounds that banks were fined in order to repay the payment protection insurances, because the High Court ruled that if you haven't told somebody that they're buying it, then it's an illegal transaction, and you ought to be sending it, you ought to be, you have to repay them. And this was an issue that's referred to as moral hazard, which is particular to the global financial crisis, because if you are selling derivatives, but you are well aware that should your bank fail, then the central bank will step in as the lender of last resort, because theoretically that's what it's there to do in order to bail out the bank. Where's the restriction to your selling these products? Bearing in mind is that you're making money by selling them in the first place, which is a good thing as far as you're concerned, but there's no downside here, is there? And that introduces the concept of moral hazard, and that the hazard has been taken away. So what's the limitation on selling these things? Well, it was proven out there was no limitations on selling these things. Both the regulatory and the ethical frameworks about selling credit default swaps and CDOs dissipated. And it carries on. The world's biggest banks have been fined 321 billion since the financial crisis. This was in 2017. I think you could add probably about another 70 billion on top of that since then. And this is quite possibly my favorite slide in the entire lecture series, all 17 lectures. And it's not very interesting, is it, until you look at it? Because what this shows is that over a 4-year running period, the blue column gives you the total of fines that have been levied against banks, okay? And it's going up. All right, fair enough. Nothing very exciting about that. What's interesting is the brown or the orange column that's next to it, adjacent to the blue one. Because what the orange one is showing is provisions that are made in accounts for banking fines. Now they stay the same. So the provisions for loans staying the same on an annual basis, and yet the amount of fines that are being paid out are actually going up. Now, this tells me a number of things. Is that one, if you're making a provision for fines, is that you're assuming that you're going to get fined. But two, is the provisions that you've made are nowhere near enough for the fines that are actually being levied. Which suggests to me is that the people at the top of the banks have no idea what others are doing within their own banks, they're in their own institutions. Either that, or they choose not to know. But whichever case that your explanation is that you've got an example of opacity, secrecy, within the institution itself, which is interesting. And global banking fines are not limited to any one particular area or bank. Is that the first column at the left there is the Bank of America, who appear to be the worldwide leaders in banking fines, but it's pretty much every major bank across the globe. And there are banks there from France, there are banks there from Holland, there are banks there from England, the UK, and so on and so on and so forth. Isn't it? Every bank gets fined. And yet, the banking industry is judged to have has been one of the most regulated industries on the planet, and also has got it would claim to have very, very high ethical standards as well. And yet, it falls foul of our expectations, not their own. And that's the problem, the tension of the moral and ethics, is that ethically subscribing to your own system and framework of morals is okay, but actually you need to look outside and see how the rest of the world is judging you as being ethical or unethical. And recently, there's been the release of what's known as the Pandora Papers. And I think I touched upon this in one of the earlier lectures. And the Pandora Papers is a series of papers, and this was the third one. So the first one was the Paradise Papers. The second one was the first one was the Panama Papers, that's right. And then there was the Paradise Papers. The Panama Papers were based around Mossack Fonseca in Panama. The Paradise Papers were about Bermuda and the Virgin Islands, specifically those small paradise islands that are basically tax havens. And then Pandora Papers is about exploding the kind of like the secrets of the people that rather they'd not be known. And it outlines clandestine affairs of big money across the globe, including 35 current and former world leaders, more than 330 politicians and public officials in 91 countries and territories, and a global lineup of fugitives, con artists and murderers, mostly of which come out of the old Eastern Bloc, and the kleptocrats that come out of Russia. And the Paradise Papers, Pandora Papers, suggest that at least $11.3 trillion worth of financial assets are held offshore. Well, what's the point of holding something offshore?
Sir?
Yeah.
The president of my country was actually featured in one of these series.
Did he?
I think the Pandora one, yeah. The Kenyan president, him and his family, they had offshore accounts, and they had a lot of money in those accounts.
But is there any suggestion that he's done something illegal?
I mean, I don't know if it's illegal or not, but I can remember his name being linked to this Pandora.
Yeah. Well, that's the point that I would make here, is that just because you hold assets offshore doesn't make it illegal. But why would we be doing it? That would be my question. Well, the only reason that you would hide something in such a way behind shell corporations and different transactions and so on and so forth would be to hide the nature of the transaction in the first place. So it's part and parcel of the secrecy, the opaque nature of finance, because that might be where you would be making tax gains, or that you didn't want to know. It brings into question, you could be doing all sorts of things, from tax evasion to tax avoidance to money laundering and complete illegalities. The point would be here is that without knowing about it, how could anybody subject the transactions to any form of scrutiny? And it's not a small amount of money. It's $11.3 trillion worth of assets. Yes, Liam?
Going back to what Abdul was saying just then, the Kenyan president was actually linked to 13 different offshoring companies.
Yeah.
So
that doesn't necessarily make it illegal, though, does it?
No. But
But why would you do it?
To avoid tax.
Yeah, exactly. I agree with you.
So it should be illegal.
It should be illegal.
But avoiding tax is not evading tax.
No, the same thing, I think. Avoiding and evading.
No, avoiding is legal. Evading is illegal.
Yeah, what's the difference?
Yeah, what's the difference?
Yeah, what's the difference? That's what I'm wondering.
Well, you just pay some tax, but well, when it's evading, you don't pay it at all, I think.
Not necessarily. You're avoiding tax, but you're avoiding paying the full amount of tax. And I think that this is an interesting distinction between what is legal and what is not illegal. Now, tax evasion is illegal. That's evading paying tax at all. Tax avoidance, which is a legal method for avoiding the payment of the full levels of tax, is legal. But what's the difference? The net result is exactly the same. It's just that one is supported by the banking sector, the legal sector, and so on and so forth. The other one is a little bit more clandestine and might involve you buying property through Bitcoin or whatever it is, but it's part of the shadow banking sector or the shadow financial sector. And really the difference is that what do we think is morally and ethically acceptable? And every time that somebody from government in the UK gets found out from involved in a tax avoidance scheme, is that, well, yeah, but this is perfectly legal. We know it's perfectly legal because you set up the legal scheme in the first place, because you are the legislators of the economy. Of course it's legal as far as you're aware, but can I do that? Can I negotiate with HMRC about how much tax I'd like to pay? I was once upon a time a tax avoider. When I was working in the private sector, I had my salary paid into my own company, which was a listed company in Bermuda. It was easy to do. All you needed was a PO box and a company number. And I had my head office for my company in Bermuda. And then my salary got paid into my Bermudan account. And I paid corporation tax as you paid it in Bermuda, which was 4% tax rather than the 50% tax I should have paid in the UK. I stopped doing it because, frankly, I grew a conscience.
Because why?
I grew a conscience.
Oh, okay.
I knew it was wrong. I knew I shouldn't be doing it. That was at the time I started to move into becoming an academic. It's impossible to know who or what is legitimate or just criminal. Key players are international banks, and specifically around big financial centers organize these things. Hong Kong, as far as I can work out, is there exclusively in order to be able to organize these details, but the rest of them are done through London and through New York. Baker McKenzie was one of the first legal firms, and it used its abilities, legislative and lobbying. In other words, it paid for its own lobbying firm in order to be able to create the modern offshoring system. And it claims, as every law firm would claim, it said, well, that is, you can't have the details because it would break our client confidentialities, which we're allowed to dominates everything, and legal privilege. In other words, you're not allowed to know. And these are not the issues about do they happen or don't they happen? They happen. These are issues that are related to morals and ethics as to what you think is acceptable and not acceptable. And as a consequence of that, in 2018, the super rich paid a lower tax rate than the bottom 50%. The bottom 50% paying a tax rate of around about 23%, and the 400 richest families in America pay a tax rate of less than that. So the argument that as an aggregate, the richer people pay the lion's share of tax. I get that, but they don't pay as much proportionately as poorer people. I remember that there's a video on the World Economic Forum where they were talking about high levels of variable tax rates. And this was in response to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez from the American Democrat Party that was saying that highest levels of tax in America should be 60% above earnings over 10 million, which people interpret incorrectly because it's everything you earn over 10 million that should be charged out at 60%. Not everything that you earn, just everything that you earn over 10 million. 10 million is quite a high threshold, isn't it? but at 60%. And there was some guy on the panelist that was complaining about this. He said, well, that's ludicrous. Whenever did that happen in history? And Brynjolfsson, I think it was, from New York State, was sat next to him and he said, oh, America in the 1970s. And he went, what? Don't be ridiculous. He said, yeah, highest tax rate in America in the 1970s was 80%. And everybody seemed to work very, very well. It's kind of like interesting, isn't it? And this is something that struck me just recently, is that in order to motivate the rich, you should give them more money. But in order to motivate the poor, you should take money away from them, which is kind of like paradoxical, I think, in many respects. And before big corporates convince you that they're paying the lion's share of the tax, no, they're not, is that the lion's share of the tax is paid by individuals in either personal taxation, income taxation, or an indirect taxation through sales taxes. Yeah. So VAT, where we pay a sales tax of 20% on some of our goods and services. In the US, there would be vary between 4 to 6, maybe 8% in some states. It's different from state to state to state. Singapore pays 4% tax plus a 10% service tax on every transaction. So in Singapore, you see prices and it says $20 plus plus. So that's $20 plus the 10% plus the 4% sales tax, which drives me mad, because whenever you buy anything, is that you've got to work out what the price is before you buy it. So it's 20. So there you go. The 20. That's $28. He said, "But sorry, the ticket says $20." I said, "Oh, plus plus." Well, why not just put it on the price, for goodness sake? And we'd all know what we were paying. But it would appear that the UK and Europe are the anomalies that are in here. But the point I'm making here is that the majority of taxation is based on indirect taxation and personal taxation. The corporate slice of overall tax take is actually quite small, relative. And of course, average corporate income tax rate has been going down. So the ability of corporations in order to be able to lobby for tax breaks, which is, well, they're very successful. And this creates a race to the bottom, doesn't it? Is that where does the corporation put its headquarters? Well, the corporation puts its headquarters in wherever it's the lowest tax dominion is. Potentially, at least. A lot of American corporations still have their American headquarters in America, but they have subsidiary corporations that are all over the globe that take that benefit from low tax dominions. But also, there's a huge amount of tax avoidance and offshoring of tax liabilities that are going on as well. But the point is that if corporations are competing on lower tax rates, then the economy that offers the lower tax rate is the one that's going to likely have those firms in their geographical areas, like Ireland, as an example. Yeah. Which again raises moral and ethical questions, doesn't it? So let's leave finance behind. Let's look at big tech. As a tech businesses are nowhere near exempt. I think I've covered some of these before, but Google place ads alongside really extremist content, or ads to extremist content as well, alongside other things. Facebook's involvement with Cambridge Analytica, vote rigging. Google spreads fake news about mass shootings in Las Vegas. Every account of Yahoo, 3 billion accounts were hacked. Apple admits to slowing old technologies by actually providing upgrades, which slows your technology down. Now you feel like your technology is now worse for wear, so therefore you buy a new one. But actually, it was the software that actually slowed your system down, not your system itself. Your system's fine. If anybody out there is actually quite tech astute, is that actually buying up some of the old Apple machines and stripping them down and just repurposing them again is a very lucrative sideline business. And there's also a very effective way of owning a good Mac. Some of the old Apple iMacs, the old little ones, mini Macs with the M1 processors, you can buy for about £175. They're fabulous. Anyway, I digress. And it's the utilization of algorithms that are the problem here. Algorithms are inherently discriminatory. Decisions are made not based on the data, but because of the data that's been organized by the algorithm, which is coded in the software. As an example, people's credit scores. How does your credit score get calculated? Well, you know what your credit score is if you download something like Experian and so on and so forth, but you would have no idea about how that's calculated. You would have no idea if you were to go to a bank and ask them for a loan and they turned you down. They've got no reasons why they'll give you why your loan has been refused, based on the algorithm that's being utilised. In the global financial crisis, people were left with negative equity in their houses, and they were making decisions as to whether or not they needed to sell up or just dump the house. And quite a lot of people went on to something which is called where'sthenote.com in order to find out what the valuation of their property was, how much it reduced, and what their personal liability was against the property. So they could calculate expenditure going forward, interest rates going forward, et cetera, and how much they were actually losing on the various properties and what it was going to cost them. But just accessing the site itself meant that your credit score dipped by 50 points. And that could take you from a precarious position into a position where nobody was ever going to lend you any money at all on that basis. But it's not transparent. That's the point. And more than that is that the algorithms themselves become arbiter, or credit scores, which is algorithmically set, become arbiters of reliability. Believe it or not, is that they will look at credit scores for things like car insurances, household insurances, and so on and so forth. So if you have a low credit rating, you can expect to pay more on your car insurance, because apparently your low credit score gives you an indication of how reliable somebody is. And part of the checks that employers will make is to check individual credit scores. Not only will they check your credit scores, but they'll also look at your social media histories as well and your profiles online. They're apparent. They are completely transparent. So they'll look at your Instagram feeds, whatever else is that they're able to get hold of as well. Which strikes me as being a somewhat not a very transparent way of recruiting somebody, particularly in something which is supposed to be a meritocracy. So without knowing what Google actually does when it ranks the sites, it's impossible to know whether it acts in good faith. And if you look at Google, is that all the first 10 or however many it is, you'll see ad. In other words, people have paid to appear on your searches. Maybe comforting to believe that your account or data is as secure as the corporations which holds it, but it's not true. Whilst the corporation may know unprecedented levels of minutiae about your behavior, we know next to nothing about them. Google are notoriously secret, high levels of secrecy. And you justify that on the grounds of corporate competitive advantage and intellectual property rights and so on and so forth. Data protection puts some constraints on the extent to which government can sift through your records, but not so with corporations. But it doesn't stop government agencies from buying the data from the corporations in the first place. So there's no limitations on what corporations can do in order to be able to harvest data, whilst there might be on governments, but there's no limitations on the government buying the data off third parties to get the data in the first place. And there's been some strange collaborations, is that Google's work on Dragonfly, which would be a Chinese-sponsored search engine, because as you'll be well aware, is that Google don't have access to the Chinese market to an extent. So they work with the Chinese authorities to create Dragonfly, which would be something that the authorities could censor. But Bing already allows its results to be censored, which means that the government has access to the data, probably. This is just an interesting photograph to show you the level of extent. Of course, you know who this is. This is Zuckerberg. And that's his computer in the background. And the two red lines on there just show that A, he's had the data port taken out so that nobody can access his information, but also there's a piece of tape over his camera. So Mark Zuckerberg is well aware that his life online is not as secret as you'd like it to be. And acknowledges the fact that your hardware can be accessed by other people. It doesn't have to be a computer. They take things like Nest, the doorbell, which is on all the time, and it records data all of the time. Your phone can be turned on remotely and either used as a listening device or can record. And yet the mission statements of the big tech corporations are something which are benign, supportive of societal good. Uber says that its transportation is reliable as running water everywhere for everyone. Lovely. And Google to organize the world's information and to make it universally accessible and useful. We have no problems with that. But we don't know how they're doing these sorts of things. And big tech is incredibly powerful or very skillful at nullifying regulations and law. And it does it by making comparisons with civil rights activists, is that we are making things reliable as running water everywhere for everyone, organizing it to making it useful. And by looking at comparisons with civil rights activists, and I've seen some statements where big tech has compared itself to people like Rosa Parks. It's liberating things. It's making things, the point would be is it's making things better for everybody. This attempt to establish services has been popular well before the regulators can get around to confronting them. And of course, the regulator is always the lowest common denominator. It doesn't know what's coming up next. By the time it regulates something, big tech has moved on. And they can also claim that they're striking a blow against the regulation that are out of date or anti-innovation. You old fuddy-duddies. We are the disruptors. We're challenging the status quo. So you government regulators, they're old conservatives that just don't understand, whereas the big tech disruptors are the groovy kids on the block, the cool ones that everybody wants to hang around with. Uber packs drivers onto the streets at peak travel in order to flood the market. And Google ignored claims of privacy violations when they went around recording people's houses for Street View. Now, latterly is that they gave people a right to complain, and you could have that images of your property removed. But interestingly, the onus would be on me to get my data withdrawn. It's not on the onus of Google to prove that they've got a right to access it in the first place. Liam has said that he was on Street View once. You'd have been very, 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 very.
I was.
And I've mentioned this notion of Pokemon Go and surveillance capitalism by Zuboff before. And I was going to talk about Pokemon Go, but I've done that. So I thought I'll see if we could find another one. And I did find another example, which is about the smart home market, which starts with Nest thermometers or internal thermometers, and then moves on to Nest, because now you've got Nest doorbells as well. So, the idea being about the Nest doorbell is that somebody rings your doorbell, it's got a camera in it, so you can see who's there before you answer the door. Well, I suppose that might well be handy if you're not there, but if you're not there, what does it matter who's answering your door anyway? And actually what you could do is you could get off your arse and walk to the front door and open it. You could then find out who's there as well without looking at your camera on your phone to be able to do it. But it's convenient, apparently. Well, the net result is that you still have to get up and open the door. If it's somebody that you don't want, so we'll ignore them. So what do? They keep dinging away, don't they, just to check. Or it's somebody that you do want to speak to, well, you have to get up and let them in anyway. So, but that's just me. But the smart home market was worth 36 billion. I forgot the B, look, there's today's typo. But it's established to be worth 138.9 billion by 2026. The idea about smart homes was based around Georgia Tech in 2000 and had three basic assumptions. that they were creating a new knowledge domain, that the new knowledge domain belonged to those within the household. The data was private, and the home was a private sanctuary. That's how they started it. And that was the underlying assumptions of it. Nest, which is owned by Google, constantly monitors and collects data, and it connects to other smart devices. The Internet of Things, it connects to the Nest thermometer, connects to the Nest doorbell, which connects to any other handheld or driven Google pieces of machinery that you've got in there as well, including the Google Assistants. I'm not sure whether it can actually jump platforms and go across to Siri as well. I don't know, but it wouldn't surprise me if it couldn't. Now, in order for you to do this, in order to accept this convenience for your smart home, is that you have to sign privacy agreements, which are pages and pages and pages, and we've all read them, haven't we? No, we haven't. Is that we just sign them and say, you get on with it, just give me the services. But actually, non-compliance, if you don't sign the privacy agreement, it negates the effectiveness of the actual device. You don't get the updates, you won't get the support. And actually the connectivity with these devices and other devices, if you really wanted to check the privacy agreements, is that you'd possibly have to go through thousands of them in order to find out where your data is being utilized and how your data is being utilized. Bearing in mind is that these are images of the house, your house, and what you do in it. So the right to own your own privacy debate is rendered obsolete by the claim that the data enables a better service. Yeah, we only collect this data so that we can provide you with a more efficient search engine, smart home system, so on and so forth. We're benign. We're just collecting the data in order to make things useful. And yet we do know that the data is the foundations of the profitabilities of a lot of big tech companies. Surveillance capitalism asserts that the human experience is a free resource for the translation into behavioral data, fed into machine learning, the end product of which is the prediction of future human behavior. In other words, Google makes its money through selling ads. Google will collect its data in order to predict which is the most effective ads that it can place and where to place them for each individual, which is great. You get a bespoke advertising service courtesy of Google. And I don't care who you are, is that those ads are, they have a potency. It's very hard not to click on them. Now, ads can be replaced by news feeds and stories and so on and so forth. The principles are exactly the same. Read Google, put Facebook. They're exactly the same. And if people think that they have complete autonomy over their own agency, I think that they are deluded. Moving on to government quickly. So big tech and finance have challenged the regulatory framework. Uber contracts and defines workers as being self-employed, contrary to Supreme Court rulings. Amazon has attempted to resist unionisation, quite underhandedly as well, it's worth pointing out. Whereas in unions, unionisation is that 50% of a whole union, the whole membership must vote in favour of industrial action. It's not 50% of those people that voted, it's 50% of the total. Now, if you think that you would apply exactly the same restrictions to votes for government or Brexit, as an example, but we don't. We've re-regulated the labour sector in favour of the commercial sector. Yes, Liam.
Hasn't Starbucks become unionised now in the US?
Possibly, I don't know, but it wouldn't surprise me, is that it is not illegal to be a member of a trade union in America. Is that if there are sufficient numbers of people that want to set up a trade union, the organisation has to allow the trade union. That doesn't mean to say that the organisation will not bring into bear discriminatory practices against people that are members of trade unions. And there are plenty of stories of people that have been dismissed for being members of trade unions.
it's just very sort of looked down upon in America, isn't it?
It's not just America, mate. I'd say it's
No,
here
true.
as well. You know,
Yeah, because
I remember I did a seminar with people like yourself, and one young man said, "Trade unions. What have the trade unions ever done?" And I just
giving us the weekend for a start.
There you go. That's always my comeback for that one. It's the weekend and lots of other things as well. And I think that it's part and parcel of a sense that you don't have any potency, a sense of powerlessness against against the wider machine. We can't do any of that. You can't do anything. That means that let's not bother trying. But of course, being a member of a trade union gives you collective authority, collective power. Because I read 4 newspapers daily, not all of it, just the bits that interest me. I read The Guardian, which, as you well know, is the left-leaning one, where I get my abilities to edit text out of, because they make as many mistakes as I do. I read the Daily Telegraph, which, as you well is right of bonkers. And then I read the New York Times and I read the Financial Times. And I go into the comments that readers make, because I think it's very telling about the kind of like the psyche of the people that are reading and how they congregate around memes and ideas and so on and so forth. And there's been this concept that people that work within the public sector are lucky because they get good pensions. Well, A, we don't get good pensions anymore. But B, they are slightly better than private sector pensions, but the public sector is unionised. Whereas the private sector is almost exclusively non-unionised. And those areas within that I've got union representation are all public sector practices that have been tupied across. But it's an interesting issue. Why would a firm not want its workforce to be unionised? Then you don't have to talk to everybody, do you? Just talk to one bloke, negotiate with one against or woman on the benefit of everyone else. And it's interesting to note is that in places like Germany and Sweden, is that the union is represented on the board of directors. Now, they seem to do all right, don't they, economically? So to me, there's the questions about why they're not represented on boards and so on and so forth is one about morals and ethics. Surely it's the right thing to do. Well, no, this is reducing our authority as a management team in order to manage effectively. No, it isn't. You just have to work with people and explain to them what's going on. So where do we get to on this one? Oh, you were talking about re-regulation and deregulation. Is access to the legal system is difficult? Legal aid in the UK has been reduced from 2 billion in 2010 to 176 billion in 2020. Now, that doesn't seem like a lot of money, but actually when you combine it with the amount of courts that have been reduced and the amount of practitioners that are engaging in legal aid work, it is significant in that it's almost like the legal system is now the exclusive purview of the people that can afford to access it. The administration of Trump rolled back the Dodd-Frank Act in May 2008. In fact, there was actually a bonfire of regulations within the Trump regulation with the expectations that it would free up its economy, which it never did during Trump's administration. But they repealed all sorts of environmental issues, just as we've done within the UK. For 3.1 million hours is that the UK dumped literal raw sewage into its river system just recently. Why? What is the motivation for doing that? And this raises all sorts of moral questions. The Police and Crimes Bill in the UK gives government the power to reject protest it doesn't agree with. Now, how legitimately Boris Johnson could disagree with anybody's right to protest is beyond me, but nevertheless, I'm sure that they will find a way. The reformation of government is effectively the dismantling of it. That's worth bearing in mind. And as a consequence of that is that we need a more robust regulatory and ethical framework than exists currently. But how is that likely to be achieved when people feel that they are powerless in order to be able to contribute? So I don't vote anymore. What's the point? They're all the same. Well, I live in a ward and in a, what do you call them, a seat that is exclusively Tory, and it has been Tory for years and years and years and years.
I want to ask, does corruption in voting happen in the UK as well?
Corruption in voting?
Yes.
Well, I'm sure that there are some disingenuous practices that occur in voting, but I think that the problem with our voting system is that it's not representative. So
Okay.
if in my region, as an example, in my area, is that the current member of parliament, who is an idiot, has got a majority of something like 16,000 votes. So it doesn't matter who I vote for, is that my vote is not represented in Parliament.
Okay.
Because we have this first past the post system. Now, you could argue, well, that's the legal system, and that's the way that we've done it for hundreds of years. No, you can't change it because that's the legal system. But is it the best system that represents people's views? Now, that is morally incorrect or morally corrupt, but it's not corrupt in that there are illegalities and people are buying votes and so on and so forth. Again, the UK system, just like the US system, is that they gerrymander the wards. So they try and create the wards so that there are as many people in it of their party so that they will win that thing. The current government has a majority in the House of Commons of 80 seats, but actually attracted only 30% of the vote. If you were a trade union, you wouldn't be allowed to do anything. But the government has an 80 seat majority. Now, it's in the parliamentary interest to keep that system going because they only need a small amount of vote in order to actually maintain levels of power. The people that lose out are the voters. We don't have a broad church of opinion. We have two opinions, broadly speaking, which is a highly liberal market-based view of the world and a less so. No wonder people don't vote. So what's the point? Nothing happens. It's been the same. And government, because of its marketisation, has shifted its operations. It's estimated in the UK for every £3 spent by government, £1 of that goes to a private contractor. So again, the government can say, well, we didn't do that. They did it, Centrica or Serco or whoever it was. Transparency thwarted as the contract details are withheld under commercial confidentiality clauses. The vast and growing franchise state is socially wasteful and administratively inefficient. So therefore, in order to solve that, we should outsource more. The private sector is inherently more efficient than the public sector. No, it isn't. There's no demonstrable proof of that at all. In fact, if the cost lines are exactly the same, the public sector should be cheaper because there's no requirement for it to make a profit. So it should theoretically be cheaper. But the public sector is hamstrung by the practices of the public, as it needs to demonstrate effective governance within the law of the land because it is a representation of the government of the day and the administration of the day, whereas the private sector has got no restrictions to it on that basis. And Vadel talks about shadow elites, which emerge as a consequence of digital technologies and financialization in order to be the beneficiaries in our economic system. And there is plenty of evidence to suggest that within the franchise state, government agencies are incapable of providing the work that is required. And I give you Hurricane Katrina as an example of that, where the population of New Orleans were given vouchers, not state aid. They were given vouchers that they could use to redeem their vouchers at private sector firms in order to get the help that they needed. So instead of getting food parcels, you got a voucher for McDonald's, which is just what you want. Do I want to do this? Are you all right, everybody? Are you getting fed up or are you okay? You're all right. Okay, right, we'll do this bit then as well. So I then started to look at theories of government. And the kind of like the theoretical underpinning of where we are at the moment. And a neoliberal government project with the centrality of markets is at odds with established conceptualizations of the right to rule. Locke talked about a contractual obligation between people and its government. There's a relationship between the two. Mill talks about the theory of right, perfect duties in the administration of justice. Again, is that the locus of government is not government in itself, but is benefit to the populace. Now, all these theories are theories that came out of the Enlightenment and dissuade away from the concept of the divine right of rulers to do whatever they want because they've been put there by God. This is more of a reasoned argument that says, well, no, you've been put there at the behest of the people in order to support the people. The American Constitution says, we the people. Not you, the government, it's we the people. We don't have a constitution in the UK. It's implied rather than being explicit, which is another area that needs to be perhaps talked about. Constant talked about a liberty of the moderns, civil liberties, the rule of law, and the freedom from state interference. To live the life as you see fit, not as the life that the government sees fit. And Rousseau, probably one of the more famous contractors, wrote about the social contract. And he said that man is born free and everywhere is in chains. Now, that is not to suggest that everybody is in chains to the point that this is sort of like slavery or modern slavery. What he's suggesting is that you are free. You have freedoms of opinion, you have freedoms of expression, but within reason. Is that the government has the right in order to be able to determine what the extent of behavior is. And in return, the government contracts to look after you, to keep you safe. And then I looked a little bit at Foucault, and this is, again, complicated. So I'll go through this briefly. What Foucault suggests is a construction of Homo economicus. Within a libertarian vision of neoliberalism, the individual is remade or remakes himself. You become the permanent entrepreneur, irrespective of social context. In classic liberalism, the individual is a social actor who competes within a narrow particular realm, along with everybody else. But within neoliberalism, within contemporary governmental thought, everybody's an entrepreneur and lives and dies by their own experiences, their abilities to be able to survive. It's hyper-individualism. You're not very successful, that was your fault. You compete on an individual basis. And this is the underpinning of a lot of markets, isn't it? Markets is based around people that operate in order to maximize their own utility. Operating for self-interest is the way in which maximizes markets, and markets tend towards equilibrium. People become very, very self-centered and individualistic within that capacity because there is now a justification to behave like that. We're doing the right thing. We're doing what people have told us to do. And narratives, remember, have the capacity to be able to perform the market. Are people inherently self-interested, or has a market approach crafted a bunch of people that have become more self-interested? Self-interested by nature or constructed by everything else that goes around you? Economics is the method, said Margaret Thatcher. The object is to change the soul. Which is very potent, isn't it? To change the soul away from what to what. For 25,000 years, we've operated within communities. It's the reason that we all got together in permanent settles in the first place. We operated as a community in order to become secure. The neoliberal project, the contemporary project, says that that's nonsense. Is that it's the survival of the fittest. Everybody works for themselves in their own self-interest, because if everybody does that, everybody gains. Well, if you refer back to Beck, is that Beck might suggest, and Beck's conceptualizations of balance and risk would say that that's not the case. Not everybody is equipped equitably to win in such a contest. We change the way that you see the consumer or the citizen. Is it not a citizen of a state, but you actually become a taxpayer and therefore a consumer of government services. which gives rise to the argument to say, well, I'm paying my tax for all of these people that are getting free meals. Why am I paying my tax for that? How do I benefit? It's not in my interest. Which creates a perverse kind of argument, a legitimate argument as to why governments would do certain things, particularly if what they've done is the government has absolved itself away from governing in the first place. Note how the government becomes an intermediary. It's just a platform for the deliverance of services through a franchise system, but it's not responsible. You are. That's your fault. We look at the narratives that the government have used in supporting their COVID strategies. We'd like everybody to be sensible, please. Take personal responsibility for doing this. Well, that's neither here nor there, isn't it? Personal responsibility. What do you mean by personal responsibility? Is that personal responsibility for me to work in my own self-interest, in which case I'm going to ignore everything that you've said? Or is it my personal responsibility to ensure that I don't infect everybody else, which means that I need to operate in a more communitarian aspect of it? Whichever way it is, it's unclear as to what it is that's going to be on there. But it gives rise for the government to say, well, it wasn't our fault. It was all these people that had parties and did this and did that and so on and so forth. It's nothing to do with me, Gov. Please vote for me in the next election. And the success of the current system is dependent upon people carrying on doing the same sort of thing. We can't change it, can you? So you just have to get with it. 1 in 5 believe the system's working for them. Taking this from a company called Edelman that do a trust barometer every year. They come up with different findings, but I just thought it was really interesting that 1 in 5 people believe that the system's not working for them. And you've got 2 populations here. You've got mass population, which is everybody, and then you've got the informed population, which in effect is people like us, all right? It's the top 20, 25% of society, and that's you guys, all right? Your university, Russell Group, come from good backgrounds for the most part, and are likely to be successful and achieve. It's you, right? And me as well. But what's interesting in this is that why that 46% of the mass population say that the system is not working for them is that 39% of the elites also say it's not working for them as well. There's a strong sense of injustice, a strong sense of a desire for change, lack of confidence, lack of hope, which is a lesser one, but it's a strong one that's in there. You can't do anything. I don't vote anymore. Pointless. They're all the same. They're only in it for themselves. That's not true. Some are. Notion of self-interest, isn't it? Why would I not do that? But not everybody's like that. And I'll just throw one last philosopher, sociologist at you. One of the big 3. You've got Marx, you've got Weber, and you've got Durkheim. I haven't really touched upon Weber. Weber's a bit dry, a bit boring. But Durkheim is of an interest because of this. Because Durkheim suggests that society is based on a system of moral norms. We work towards acceptable levels of behaviours. Well, you can't do that, can you? You can't do that. You shouldn't do that. So we agree on a normalisation of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And if we can do that, is that Durkheim suggests that you have a life-sustaining equilibrium. And he doesn't mean an equilibrium, he just means balance. He doesn't mean an optimal thing where you can measure it out like that. But he does suggest that within it that there's a problem because of what he refers to as the malady of the infinite, is that people's desires and aspirations know no bounds. And as a consequence of that, there is always a tension between the life-sustaining equilibrium, the moral norms, and my desire to get more stuff for myself, which is exacerbated by narratives of self-interest. You're on your own. You get what you can. It's all about me, individualism, and my capacity to be able to achieve. Another word might be take. But the absence of the moral norms is that Durkheim calls anomie. That's not his expression, but he's the one that probably wrote about it most than anybody else. And within a capitalist framework is that capitalism rewards relationships that are transactional, temporary. It's mercenary, in other words. You only do it because of the money. I work because I get paid to do it. And actually, I'm taught that I should work and I should seek the highest level of pay that I can do. Not because of any sense of aesthetic. There was a marvellous debate under the line this morning about why teachers teach and the Guardian newspaper. And one person said that, well, we do it because of the emotional reward that you get of doing it. And I include myself in that as well. And I subscribe to that particular view, is that you wouldn't do this for money. You do it because of the reward that you get out of it by, well, frankly, being put in a privileged position of being able to shape young people's lives. That is incredibly powerful for me as a motivating force, something that I hold very dear and something I take seriously. And then people will like say, well, that's ridiculous. Why don't you just go and get a better job, a job that's better paid somewhere else? It's all about the money. And yet most people do work that's kind of grabbers of shit jobs. You don't see the end product. So the end product is not, what do you do? Well, I work on, I make, I was trying to think, make bumper stickers. We could do without bumper stickers. You know, it doesn't really add much there apart from people looking at it and go, oh, great that. You know. But a lot of people's work that they do is not engaging to the extent that you do it because you think that you're doing something that's important for society. You do it because of the fact that you should get paid for it. It's transactional. I have a friend of mine who works in R&D in the chemical industry. He's got the capacity to be able to change the world. As chemicals all use that oil as their basic foundation. And yet they can create different polymers, natural polymers, in order to create the same products, but they don't do it because there's too much risk and too much money that's involved in it, and they won't be able to make a return. So he focuses his life on making the new blue, something that's bluer than it was. And literally, there is a blue index. I just thought, how ridiculous is that? That all of those intelligent, bright people that came to work because of the fact that they believed in innovation, they believed in science, they believed that it could change the world, and have been focused on making the new blue. But the majority of people do that. It's transactionary, it's mercenary. And one of the examples that Durkheim points to is that institutions of the state no longer work in the general interest of the majority. Just look around you. If the US minimum wage was pegged to productivity, it'd be worth about $20 an hour now. At the moment, it's $7.50, I think, isn't it? You can't live on $7.50 an hour in America. You can't live on $20 an hour in America, for that matter. But that's the result of anomie, is that the institutions of state don't work on behalf of its population, which is in contrast to the moral philosophers of Mill and of Constant and others that said there's a contract between government and the people. The people accept that they will behave in a certain way if the government looks after us. And one of the important institutions of state is business and is companies or companies. Do companies have a moral requisite in order to be able to support its wider society? Should they? Or should they, according to Friedman, the only moral responsibility that a firm has is to maximize its profitability? They're quite naive, I think. Corporations have such an extensive reach within our wider society, whether it be from secret capacities or just through the products and the way that they behave, the way that they consume, the way that they bring people together. And there's a question here is about whether or not government should be run like a business, which fills me full of horror, actually, is that government therefore is being provided by the person that can provide it the cheapest. I don't think so. That's not what we want, is it? There's got to be more to it than that. And therefore, what we really ought to the question is that should business be more like a government that works in support of its people and all its constituents, not just a select few. So we've got this tripartite dynamic that's very powerful within our current society of government, big tech, and finance that regulate the globe around them, but they regulate it in their own images and to their own betterments. And they've all got narratives that support the reasons why they do what they do. And my question is, are they sufficient? And really is what we're talking about here is not a it's not an operational issue of efficiency and effectiveness, because underpinning all of that is not the regulation and the law. It's about an understanding of ethics, about what we should be doing things for. Why should we be doing things in the way that we're doing things? And who are the beneficiaries? Fully accepting the fact that there are always going to be winners and losers. There's always going to be a differential between, the state is not equitable. There will be people that are going to be better off than other people. But if the people that are at the bottom of the pile, they should still be able to live their life with a degree of respect and decorum and safety. And that is enshrined in the principles of the United Nations. They are human rights. Sometimes we trip over human rights as our governments seek to repeal the Human Rights Bill, because within our own institutions, some people are more human than others, clearly. After which I demonstrate my own opinion on politics. And recently, people have been pointing to the popular election of people like Trump and Johnson, but there are many others. Modi in India is another example, including Hungary and Poland and other parts. Australia as well has fallen to another populist. And people have drawn attention to authors like Hannah Arendt and looking for examples of totalitarianism and authoritarianism. And there are elements that are in there as well. And they're suggesting that people ought to read 1984, George Orwell's 1984, his treatise on a totalitarian state. And I don't think that's right. I think you've got the wrong book. I think they've got the wrong book. What they should be looking at is they should be looking at Huxley's Brave New World, within which a people have become complicit and compliant. I don't care. As long as I get my beer and my football and a fed a drug, whatever your drug of choice is, whether it be the internet, sex, football, whatever it is, it don't matter. As long as we're all happy. Don't bother me. Leave me alone. I operate in my own self-interest, and it perpetuates. Now, you, as young people, you'll go out into the world, and I don't know, when I was your age, I looked at my dad and I looked, you fucked up the world, old man. And when I'm in charge, things are going to be different. Well, hey ho, I had my chance. Guess what? It didn't make a blind bit of difference. You guys, I hope will make a difference. Not only will you be successful in your corporate careers, but you'll see your corporation as being, or your corporate careers as being something more than that. And I think that it's changing. And I wish you, honestly, I wish you all the success in your studies. And I wish you all the success in your careers as you move forward. And I hope that as you do go forward, some of the debates in which we've taken part at the course of this lecture series will have an impact upon the way that you do things as you seek to change the world. Thank you for listening.